Good afternoon, and welcome to one of the many events we have organized to celebrate the 80th anniversary of the Voice of America that are going to take place throughout the year. Today, we are going to recognize our legacy, looking back at our past as an essential exercise to move forward and envision the future of the Voice of America and its role in the world. For my opening remarks, I'm sharing with you some of the same sentiments I shared on the 80th anniversary event for our workforce this past Tuesday. As you know, this agency was launched in the depths of the World War II on the premises that honest, reliable reporting was a more powerful weapon than propaganda, and that its independence from government interference was the key to its credibility. Congress has underscored that independence with legislation at various times, and VOA journalists have risen up to resist every attempt to infringe on it over the years. That's why, in many lands, at many times, we have heard people say, I heard it on VOA, so it must be true. The enemies of truth have evolved and multiplied over the years, but at VOA, we have also strengthened our commitment to truthful reporting by expanding it to include a vigorous defense of press freedom wherever in the world it comes under attack. Our shared mission has often demanded great courage, whether from the reporters who venture into conflict zones to find the truth on the ground and the technical teams that support them, or those who have risked their careers to report honestly and defend our independence. But many have paid a greater price. Their names can be seen on the memorial to fallen VOA journalists on the wall of the Cohen Building in Washington, D.C., where VOA is headquartered. Yet, through every challenge, VOA has prevailed. To talk about this and about the future of VOA, we have put together a formidable group of experts and scholars. But first, I'm pleased to introduce to you to our acting service chief of the English to Africa, Ndimyake Mwakalyelye, who will serve as the moderator of this discussion and will now introduce our distinguished panelists. Ndimyake.
Thank you so much for that background and also for the introduction, Yolanda. And as Yolanda said, I'm Ndimyake Mwakalyelye, and I'm so honored to be your moderator today. We are in Washington, D.C., so this is East Coast time for all of you who are watching from around the world. And we are just so honored to be able to bring this discussion to you on this 80th anniversary of the Voice of America. Now, we have a very distinguished guest panelists who are going to walk us through what is the relevance and the importance of independent media? How does VOA contribute to independent societies by what it does, which is the aim of independent media? I'm going to introduce the panelists very briefly before we go into the discussion. Professor Sanford J Unger is a former VOA director and now director of the nonpartisan Free Speech Project at Georgetown University. In the past, he was president of Goucher College, Washington editor for the Atlantic magazine, and then also co-host of the National Public Radio's or NPR's All Things Considered. Ann Cooper is Professor Emerita at Columbia Journalism School. She was also NPR's first Moscow bureau chief, covering the tumultuous events of the final 5 years of the Soviet Union. She has continued to write about press freedom and media in Russia and other former Soviet republics. Nicholas J. Cull is professor of public diplomacy at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism. And originally from the UK, he is a well-known writer and historian on issues of communication, public management, and international relations, and also an author of 2 histories dealing with Voice of America. And finally, I'm introducing Roya Mahboob. She's an entrepreneur and one of the first female tech CEOs from Afghanistan. Roya lived under the Taliban's control as a child. Her company, Digital Citizens Fund, focuses on digital literacy back home. And she's also co-founder of the highly accomplished Afghan Robotics Team. I'd like to welcome you all, our distinguished panelists, to this conversation on this very important day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Glad to
So,
meet you,
just also,
Ndimyake.
thank you so much. Just to share with you, the audience who are watching us across the world on YouTube, we are speaking from a virtual event platform, and the event is playing on YouTube, where most of you are watching. You are very, very welcome to share your thoughts and your questions. We have a chat box, which is to your right. So please feel free to submit your questions through that chat, and it's on the right hand of your screen. And please note that if you're watching this in full screen, you will not be able to see the chat window. So if you want to chat, you might have to reduce that. So without all that said and all introductions made, I want to just delve right into this conversation. So this is the 80th anniversary of VOA. This is not the actual event because many of us did quietly on Tuesday observe that day. But today we're looking back 80 years of independent journalism. VOA's first radio broadcaster, William Holland Hale, said these very keywords. The news may be good for us, the news may be bad for us, but we should always tell the truth. So I want to throw this question for you, Professor Unger. You are the VOA's 24th director, and this question, I'm sure you've been reflecting on it. What are your thoughts around VOA's 80th anniversary in light of Hale's words? Is VOA measuring up? Has it measured up?
Well, thank you, Ndimyake. I'm very pleased to celebrate this moment in VOA's history. Just to clarify, I was director from 1999 to 2001. I left before 9/11 in 2001. And I think we all suffer from this feeling that when we did something, that was the golden age. That was the best moment it ever had. I would say that when I was director of VOA for those 2 years, to the best of my conceivable energy and knowledge, we told the truth. We did not engage in propaganda that is so attractive to so many people. And I think it was a great moment for VOA. It was a difficult time because after the Cold War, there were some services that many people thought were no longer necessary because there was a more open media climate in their countries, especially in some of the formerly communist nations of Eastern Europe. And so some of those services were eliminated. I think there are moments now when many people wish we had not eliminated those, that we could use them again because of the troubles that many people are experiencing in Eastern Europe. But I have to say that during my time, even more than I imagined when I agreed to become VOA director toward the last years of the Clinton administration, that VOA was a beacon to the world. There were so many places in Africa, in Asia, maybe a different audience from the one originally envisioned, where people were so dependent on VOA to tell the unvarnished truth about what was happening in their own countries and other parts of the world. And I think that is the proudest tradition of VOA. There are obviously moments under political pressures when VOA may have strayed. I think during the Iraq War, to some extent, that was true. I think that we know that in the Cold War, the Red Scare period, that there were a lot of threats, so it was very hard to maintain the independence of VOA in that period as well. But by and large, over this institution's 80-year history, it has done something terribly important to the preservation of American democracy and to the preservation of other democracies around the world. It has stood firm and clear against all sorts of challenges. And I think it's wonderful. I appreciate the words from Yolanda López. I identify exactly with what she says about VOA and its mission and role in the world today.
Thank you so much, Sandy. And also want to let the audience know that with the panelists' permission, I will refer to them sometimes and occasionally by their first names. And of course, occasionally I might just really not be able to and call them professor, as many of them are. I want to move now to Roya. So as a child growing up under Taliban control and media being so restricted, you were on the receiving end of what public independent media aims to do, which is really to empower societies and provide independent news free of government interference. do you feel that VOA, other independent media, and more open information help to open up opportunities for women in, like you and just your fellow countrymen in general?
Sure. I remember the timing that when in 1996, when Taliban took over the country, and the media landscape basically didn't exist. And I still remember the time that they came into each houses at the time, their fighters, to collect the TVs, and they set them, most of those TVs on the fire. So television, music, and cinema were banned, and we had only very darkness, and our world was very colorless. And the only, the way of that getting the news from world, it was the radio that the Taliban's, propaganda of that regime at that time. We only hear that, and that's the way that I think that in any countries, the extremists and the dictatorship trying to censor and giving one reality to the world and one reality, to their people, is that you will hear what they say, and you will feel it that is true. But at that time we had a couple of years during the Taliban, and that was not the good years for many of us, because for women we didn't have a chance to go to the schools, to continue our educations, and they couldn't work. And then in 2001, when the Americans and NATO came to Afghanistan, things has been changed suddenly for many of Afghans, and the media in Afghanistan, like many other sections, is changed, and it was a success stories, and it was very helpful during the time. We had a lot of at the time it started with a couple of the television. Obviously, the Voice of America is one of the not one of them that at that time I think working with the Afghan national TVs, and most of the news is coming by them, and obviously we had other private TV and televisions that providing the news and many other programs. But I think that one thing that was very clear is that Voice of America is clearly make themselves different than other news agencies, and it was that obviously for my father at the time that wants to watching the TV and watching the news and wants to know the reliable and credible news, they wanted to look at the Voice of America, what they say, because that when we say that the TVs and media is growing, but there was always a bias exist, and many of the TV and channels, they were kind of rely on either as part of the religious or the political parties, or the way that the propaganda of them, or the way that they want to present it. And obviously that I have to say that the Voice of America was one of a few media organizations that play an important role in terms of giving the reliable and credible news that you could trust it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Roya. I want to turn to you, Professor Anne. Let's step back to the last days of the Cold War. What did you see developing on the ground coming out of the propaganda-infused societies? And did you get a sense that public media and press freedom developed quickly? And was it influenced by VOA, RFE, and maybe the BBC and others?
Well, I think it's important to understand how important Voice of America and the other services were during the Soviet era, and even right up to the final days of the Soviet Union. Today it's hard to imagine the control that the Communist Party had over information, but everything, TV, radio, magazines, newspaper, all totally party controlled, full of lies, full of propaganda. Often though, the worst thing was just the information wasn't there. Greatest example, 1986, the nuclear power plant explosion in Chernobyl. Nothing, not a word was said in Soviet media about it for 3 days. So, and there was no internet. People didn't have personal computers at home. Where could they get real information? They could pull out their shortwave radio and tune into what they called the Golosy, which is Russian for voices. That obviously, that term came from Voice of America, but it also referred to the BBC language services, Deutsche Welle, all of which were giving them, factual information that they could not find any other way, really, at that point. So, I think testimony to how important that was the amount of effort that the Soviet Union put into jamming those broadcasts as they came in. So, sometimes you couldn't hear anything at all, but you kept trying because otherwise you were just sitting there in the dark. So they had this, really vital role through the Cold War. 1991 comes along, Soviet Union disappears. As Sandy Unger pointed out, some of the services were cut back because there was a lot of optimism, like, independent media is going to rise up in these countries and provide people with the stuff that the Golicy, had been doing. But it really hasn't worked out that way. Of the 15 Soviet republics, which are now 15 separate countries, only 3 of them have genuine press freedom and, pretty strong independent media. And that's Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, 3 of the smallest Soviet republics. Great for them, but what about everybody else? About half of those countries have, dictatorships or autocratic leaders, Vladimir Putin, Lukashenko in Belarus, and, and there's, where there is independent media, it's under constant stress. Belarus, we saw dozens of journalists thrown in jail this last year. They can't do their jobs. And so sadly, the Golicy are still needed to in some of these countries, and sometimes to a very large degree.
I want to turn to you now, Professor Nick, just to round up at least this particular segment as we reflect on the 80th anniversary. So, of course, you're a historian and a scholar of public diplomacy. So, with the VOA Charter, which was written into federal law back in 1976, and a firewall that keeps the government out, there's a question that, is that really necessary in a country that has this notion of the free press in its constitution?
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. But of course it's necessary because it's in the nature of government to control. It's in the and especially if you're talking about international broadcasting, diplomacy will always want good things to be said on the air, and you can't always report good things. Sometimes you have to report bad things about allies, and you have to report bad things about yourself. And that's been VOA's job over the years, is to give both good and bad news. And sometimes that bad news has been about the United States, as during Watergate, as during the final days of the Vietnam War, when there were negative things concerning the United States that had to go out to international audiences. Part of the reason that the VOA Charter came into law in 1976, and in fact was written way back in 1960, was that governments didn't tolerate, or governments pushed against, particular administrations pushed against a kind of gentleman's agreement version of the Charter. It had to have the force of legislation for it to be respected. And almost immediately after the Charter was written into law, VOA journalists, VOA directors had to push back against the State Department, who didn't like this story going on, who didn't like that particular perspective on say, Egypt or some other sensitive country. And it really helped the VOA director to be able to say, you may not like it, I may not like it, but we have a charter obligation to give both sides of the story. It isn't about what makes people happy, it's about what is actually going on in the world. So I see the VOA Charter as being a tremendously important thing. But remember that it came into force. It was written in 1960 to clarify VOA's role. And I think that having that kind of clarification is important. The VOA did not have the benefit of its charter way back in 1942, and we should be careful to understand that what we have now, the treasure we have now in Voice of America, has taken many years to come to the standard that it is at today.
But yet the notion that VOA is a propaganda station, a mouthpiece of the government, somehow still persists. Professor Unger, can you weigh in on that?
Well, I think that there are some people who can't imagine that a government-funded news organization could be independent from the government. And of course, as others have said, and Ann Cooper said so articulately, in many governments in many countries for decades, there was a nod to press freedom, but there was no press freedom at all. So this idea that the U.S. government could fund an organization that was not a spokesperson was very confusing to some people. And even during my time, I must say, I won't mention who it was, but one American ambassador, a domestic politician who got an ambassadorship from the Carter administration, who was serving in one of the countries that where we suspended the service because of this dream that now the countries of Eastern Europe were going to have open media, called me up one morning and said, "You will not stop the service to my country, to the country I represent, the United States. I'm telling you right now, you will not stop it." And I said, "With respect, Mr. Ambassador, I don't report to you. It's not up to you whether we broadcast in the country where you happen to be serving or not." And he wanted it, I think, not because he was such a believer in free information and open media. He wanted it because he wanted to serve his interpretation of the American purpose in that country. And there were other times too. I mean, I might tell Roya a story that when I was director and the struggles were going on in Afghanistan, 1999, 2000, early 2001, and we had a correspondent in Islamabad who wanted to go into Afghanistan, as he should have done, to report what was going on. And the American ambassador in Pakistan at the time had theoretical control over all of the U.S. employees in the country, in Pakistan. So he said, "You will not go into Afghanistan because you're a government employee." And I said, the needs of gathering the news require that he go into Afghanistan. And I defied the ambassador in Pakistan. Well, a week or so later, people came over from the State Department to investigate and to ask me, well, could it be true that you defied the orders of the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan? And I said, you bet I did. You don't have to investigate. I'll confess right now, because that was the journalistic need of the moment. So I'm not trying to portray myself as a hero. Nothing happened to me except I had a little fun over this. Eventually, I went through Pakistan and talked to the ambassador, and we reached a sort of understanding. We agreed to disagree in some ways. But for the most part, over the years, VOA directors have stood up for this and have made it clear that if this is worth doing, it's worth doing in the greatest American tradition. And I think this is a moment when we have to fight very hard to extend that belief to make sure, because we don't know what the political fortunes will bring in Congress in the months ahead. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that the tendency in the Trump administration to try to take over VOA and make it a propaganda agency under Mr. Pack and others will be resumed. And we need an understanding in this country, among the political forces in this country, the value that Voice of America has for making it clear that we mean what we say, we practice what we believe, and what's in the VOA charter.
That's right.
That must continue no matter what.
I mean, two things to say here. One is that the VOA Charter was a bipartisan measure. And I think it was very important that politics of a certain kind stopped at the water's edge, and both sides in American politics thought public diplomacy was important and thought that VOA playing a role by giving a gift of independent journalism to the world was important. That was part of the foundation of the high points in VOA's VOA's history. Another thing, to build on what Sandy was saying, there are some great examples in VOA's history of officials who had been very keen to impose policy on VOA, moving from the policy side to the voice, and then taking the journalist's point of view. The institution has a wonderful way of I think they say where you sit is where you stand. Right. And the internal traditions at VOA of independence rub off even on the administrators who come to work with them.
A quick footnote to what Nick just said. The VOA Charter became law while Gerald Ford was president of the United States, right? Not while a Democrat was president of the United States. And unthinkable as that may be today, that's a very important fact, that it was a bipartisan effort, and that it survived and it worked.
And the charter was initially promulgated under Eisenhower. It's not some sort of Kennedy fancy. It was Eisenhower who thought it was a good idea, right. And Eisenhower said he wanted something that was as good as the BBC.
Mm-hmm. This determination to install this culture of independent media, especially when there's so many reasons to not. I'm wondering, and this question is for you, with all that is happening in Russia, in China, and conflicting efforts, to one side trying to tell the truth, another side not being able to tell the truth. How do you see the Voice of America and other entities of similar makeup faring in environments like that?
Yeah, I think it's a really confusing time because, that notion that, it's government funded, so it's got to be propaganda. I think we all know that, yes, that government funding does create that vulnerability, as we just saw during the Trump administration, but it doesn't mean, automatically that this is a propaganda mouthpiece. And if you look at there's a lot of state-funded media that's broadcasting globally right now. The BBC, Voice of America, Deutsche Welle, they were out there for a long time. Al Jazeera came along in, I can't remember exactly when, 2000 or early 2000s or a little before that. It's state-funded. And some people said, hey, they just give a platform to terrorists. But other people said they are doing really solid journalism. It's reliable, it's factual. France 24 is completely financed by the French government, but a very reliable source. On the other hand, there's RT, which began its life as Russia Today and is, totally a Kremlin tool. Would like to say, hey, we're the equivalent of these other, government-funded services, but they're not. So I think it puts the onus a lot on the news consumer to try to figure out what am I actually being told here? What's behind this? These are all government-funded services, but they have different mandates. They operate with different degrees of independence, and because it's government funded, it could change depending on who is in charge of the government. I go back
to be honest, Anne, as it has changed over the years. And VOA began in 1942 as in the context of propaganda, and it has evolved. RFERL began as stations subsidized by the CIA. It doesn't make sense now to raise that, as regularly happens on RT, because that model of RFERL history was set aside, at the in the late 60s, early 70s. But it still comes up. It's important to talk about what VOA is now and what RFE/RL are now and what they're contributing now, which is substantially different and has a different ethical foundation to what the other stations are doing. But I think we have to be honest about the context in which these stations began, which was a context of ideological warfare.
Right, absolutely. And I had forgotten about RFE/RL, and I never saw it in that period, but today RFE/RL is really vital in some of these former Soviet states. They're showing the way. Here's how you do independent journalism. By the way, we're financed by the U.S. government, but it's trustworthy, it's fact-based, and in some of these former Soviet states, everything or most of the remaining media is not. It's just not reliable.
Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I think that media actually, it's playing very important role in improving the government's accountability and reducing productions. And so it's important that we have a media that not have bias, and it's actually giving the fact and not propaganda or not fake news. And unfortunately, it's in the countries that we are living. I mean, I was also living in Iran and then back to Afghanistan. So when they say that the media is funding by the governments, it's always this coming as like assumptions coming that yes, when if BBC is funding by UK, it means that they expanded the propaganda of the UK through their media. The same things they say about the Voice of America at the beginning, but after a while, when you're checking the Voice of America's news, it was the balance. They show the good news and also bad news, but also in the same time, they didn't took they didn't took this size of the politician or that side. They just giving the facts news, which was created credibility and created that people make more trusted, especially during the campaign of presidential campaign in Afghanistan, that it was making the local news less credible. I mean, I don't say that all Afghan news are less credible, but it's just when I have to say that we had a great, the last 20 years, we had one of the very successful industries was the media. Before 2001, we didn't have journalists, that there was no TV, but after that we created the journalism, faculties. We had a lot of like females coming to the TVs, or we had more than hundreds of this news, either as a TV or newspapers, or they're using the social media to giving the news, and they created making a lot of the money, so also make it profitable. But then one thing is that it's not only about the Afghan journalists, but I think that it's very important that we have to understand is that the fake news is it's a lot, even in the United States, and it's also in Afghanistan as well. And it should be creating a rules in the future, ethic codes for the journalism, that they learn that it's not about what always people wants to see and wants to check, but it's important that we're giving the real stories and truths. And it's so important that we just not create the content just to sell the content. And it's important that the content should be truth, because it's and be reliable and be fact. It's not. This is something that we needed to work. I think that in longer term, especially when social media right now is growing very fast, and many the younger generation are using the social media to follow the news, and the fake news is a lot, and propaganda of many of people just checking the titles without even clicking to read that articles, and then they're giving this misinformation spreaded among of the people. And I think that's why it's important that we have considered in the future of how we can create the independent media that's also be reliable and not have the fake news, but But it's again back into the ethical, to have ethic journalists is important, and it should be work. I don't know how it could be. There is no any special recipe that we can say that we can go through that way. It will resolve the biggest challenges that today we're seeing in the media. But
It's a very important point, which we're going to get to. Go ahead, Roya. Sorry, I kind of overspoke.
Yeah, I mean, it's just there's other issues. I mean, Afghanistan's we had a great time with the media. We had the freedom of speech, but it's also freedom of speech should bring the responsibility for the people that they call themselves as a journalist, that they have to do investigative journalism, not just selling the content that it's serve only one politicians or one group of the people. And what we have been seeing is that the Afghan governments is getting weakened and weakened over a time, and there is created a gap between people and the previous governments. And I wouldn't say that the media is one of the way of that why Afghan governments fell, but I think that they played very important role. Media, as I read it somewhere, that media is very powerful because it can make someone's innocent as a guilty and a guilt person as innocent. So that's why we have to focusing on the media to bring transparency and also be true. And
which is the core of public, which is the core of independent media. But I think you raised some points that I'd love to hear an elaboration and expansion from Ungar, from Sandy, Nick, and Anne, which is this distinction between state media and public media, and how sometimes people confuse the two, and also the relevance that Roy also made about the importance of practicing ethical journalism, and sometimes the situation that journalists find themselves in, where there's a lot of compromise.
Well, of course, Ndimyake, there have been some of these issues have been issues for a very long time before we even had the idea that there were people called journalists. There was always this problem about getting information from about the governors to the governed, and it's always been an issue. I think one of the best ways to judge Voice of America today and how it's doing its job is to see the number of awards that journalists like you from VOA are winning. And these are not awards conveyed by the U.S. government or by some agency of the U.S. government. These are nominations that come from around the world, and VOA wins these awards because there's a hardcore of people within the Voice of America who are dedicated to its purpose and do their job, including some very tough investigations, some very inconvenient results, inconvenient for the United States, for some of the other governments it supports. And no one is stopping them at the moment. This is a remarkable thing. So I think that's one way of judging what VOA is doing. And I also think Anne and Nick spoke about RFERL. When I was director of VOA, we always felt a little competitive about them. Why do we have to share the funding with them? Why they get in our way a little bit? But there was actually a very valuable competition among the government-funded services, just as there ought to be in the private sector. So I think that, and these days, with something like Fox News, which should not even be classified as journalism anymore, and some other so-called networks as well, there's a greater need than ever for these independent media. I wish VOA had a bigger audience within the United States. It's finally legal. There used to be a prohibition on this. It's finally legal for VOA to put out its news in the United States, and I wish it had more people following it, because it's a fantastic, almost unparalleled source of information about the world.
And
you mentioned, people don't understand the distinction between state media and public media. And even within, the sphere of what we call public media, there's so many different models. And it all boils down to, how is it funded and how protected is it, how insulated is it from pressure. And there are some public media models that are not very insulated and therefore, you know, become more like state media. But you know, everybody says, oh, BBC, there's the model. That's what we should aspire to. Even BBC will come under pressure with some regularity, I think. So I think we've never given the public clear definitions of what these terms mean. And I think, you know, in legal terms, it's also not clear. It's kind of all over the map.
We are almost running out of time. We only have about 20 minutes left, but I really want to get to a very, very key point of this conversation, which is, okay, we are celebrating the 80th anniversary right now, but what is the future beyond now? What is in store for public media, Voice of America? I mean, when you find that there's so much competition now, social media, disinformation, cutting of funding.
If I could jump in on this one,
yes, please.
I think that this was minimally, this is no time to be backing out of independent international media. This is no time to be cutting budgets. This is no time to be closing down services. We need more reliable media in the world to compete with what, you know, some people have called the fire hose of falsehood coming from the authoritarian and disruptive regimes out there. So I also don't think this is any time to step away from the administration of public diplomacy more broadly. And I'm appalled that this administration has yet to nominate an Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, or that senior role in the strategy of in the management of American public diplomacy is vacant 40% of the time. That does not show that that administrations, whichever the party in control, do not give this work the kind of support that it needs. And what international broadcasting needs is it needs investment. I think the journalists have a good idea what needs to be done, but it takes investment. It takes somebody to pick up the check, and it's quite ridiculous right now, the lack of support for international broadcasting and public diplomacy more broadly.
There are also pushes to this. I'll refer to an article that was written by the former ambassador to Russia, who is advocating for a reconstitution of the Voice of America and make it maybe fall as it used to be under the United States Information Agency. Can you weigh in on that?
Well, I don't think that's an especially good idea, and I don't think it reflects an authentic knowledge of what actually happened during the Cold War or how the United States Information Agency worked. What made VOA impactful was that it was credible, and what made it credible was that it could give both the positive and the negative news, and the attention that went to VOA at times of crisis, times of scandal, was considerable to make sure that stories like Iran-Contra or Watergate were properly covered. That's where VOA's credibility came from, and that's its significance. I don't think we need voices in the world scoring points off other countries. We need the United States to be providing a service of reliable journalists. And I think that now international broadcasting, it's not about saying the right thing. It's about empowering people to tell their own stories to one another. And the model of journalism has changed since 1942. Now it's about empowering. And the great strength of VOA is the diversity of journalists around the world from many backgrounds who are speaking to their home communities about what's really important.
And Ndimyake, if I may just, with respect to the former ambassador to Russia, I don't think he really understands the situation very well, I'm sorry to say. USIA had some wonderful diplomats and and some wonderful public servants over the years. But it was really a post-World War II necessity to find a home for some of these U.S. information efforts, including Voice of America. It came eventually to be a great lumbering bureaucracy on its own part. You had some countries in some situations where the State Department said one thing, USIA said another, and there was a lot of confusion created. The solution is not to go back to that period. The solution is to build up these independent, government-funded agencies, news organizations, to have a strength that they can't be attacked, can't be torn down, and continue to do their role. I think that this desire to suck them back into the State Department in one form or another, or to achieve control of them, I mean, I saw what that could mean, and it was not a good idea.
But where I do think Ambassador McFall, who we're discussing here, makes sense, is that you have to think about creating media that can be shared as content. But in fact, VOA led the way in creating shareable news stories and focusing on news you could use on handheld devices. And but absolutely, I think that's the way you have to conceptualize international broadcasting.
Absolutely,
as making reliable things that can be shared, not in the way that it used to be in the 1950s, where you had a stream of content that somebody would listen to. They'd hear the news, then they'd hear Willis Conover playing jazz, then they'd have listen to a Thornton Wilder play, and then there'd be more news. Nobody is consuming international broadcasting that way. They're cherry picking the stories that are relevant to them and sharing those with their own trusted social media audience. That's the dominant element.
Although I wouldn't want to minimize the role of Willis Conover. I just some feedback for some reason. I wouldn't want to minimize the role of Willis Conover and others in that era. Because
pardon me. No, of course not. Of course not.
Jazz
we can't imagine that we're still in that. We're not at that moment.
No,
my point is, we're not at that moment where most people in the world are consuming international broadcasting as a flow.
No, that's right.
We're now picking individual moments, and to me, Willis Conover is one of the great Americans, somebody who made a tremendous contribution to American foreign policy, to American soft power in the world. And he is also an important part of VOA history, as are the other cultural elements in VOA's programming over the years.
Nick, I've heard it said that there were periods when Willis Conover was the second best known American in the world.
That's right. Yes,
in many parts of the world. After whoever was president. That's
Willis
Conover was known. And
yes.
And by playing the jazz and doing the interviews he did, he planted a seed for independence, for improvisation, for freedom of musicians. It's no accident that when Czechoslovakia in its communist days began to fall apart, it was the jazz section of the Musicians Union in Czechoslovakia where much of the then subversive activity began.
That's correct. And to the inheritors of Willis Conover's legacy today are working with other musical genres, including hip hop. And so, but I think he was tremendously important, and something that I wish more Americans were aware what he achieved. But also, he took a personal decision to remain a contractor at VOA, never to be actually employed by VOA, because he wanted to have that bit of distance from a government entity. So just to circle back on some of the themes that we've been dealing with here.
Ask Anne to jump in. I mean, the reality is that it is under threat. Budget cuts are real. There's an encroachment of so many other elements of media now, social media, more independent media. In light of all that, the pressure that public media is under, and Can it survive?
Well, I certainly hope so, because I think, as we've been discussing for almost an hour now, it's still very much needed. And in places where 30 years ago we thought, oh, well, that's not really going to be essential anymore. But there's so much to stay on top of now, like how to deal with disinformation, how to figure out how to be on all the platforms that, things like TikTok, which I've never looked at. But, you've got to be everywhere now. So I think that just argues to, trying to stay current, to try to make the service as relevant and, as contemporary as possible, so that you continue giving people what they need, just as back in the Cold War days. What did they need? They just needed basic information, truthful information. Well, that's changing now. And so I think the services have to change, figure out how to adapt to that.
Thank you, Roya. What about you? What do you think the role of public media, VOA included, is playing or can play in Afghanistan going
I think
forward?
that it's very important to know that with Taliban governments today giving a lot of rules for the journalists, that it will create the censorship and repression. And they just created 11 rules that for journalists that, they would, the topics that they have to choose should not be conflict with Islam or insulting international personalities. And, it might create more rules in the futures. And I think that that's why it's so important with this current situation that VOA, Voice of America, will play an important role in giving the truth and giving the reliable and unbiased information to the people of Afghanistan. I also think that because the VOA is only right now, the section is very more active is the news and reporting, but I hope that they have doing more investment on creating more content, entertainment content, cultural content, and do more engaging with the social media in general. It would be great because this would be the a source of that reliable information that many people in many cultures, especially those people who are living under the dictatorship countries and censorship governments, they can see that and they can get engaged. But as social media is growing very fast, it's I think that as much we people likes it, but I think the younger generations likes more using the social media to looking at the news. And it would be great that the future funding will be some investment on the social media and creating more content to tell the truth, but in the entire entertainment ways, or in a way that you can engage in the youth generation as well, because that is important for the future.
Yes, I did read somewhere there's an advocate, they're also advocating for more TikTok than television. Many suggestions included in terms of how to reconstitute VOA going forward into post 80th anniversary. I want to get to a little bit of the comments that have come in. The very fact that this is Dan Kubishke, the very fact that VOA has run news items critical of the US government is proof of its editorial independence and why it is an example to emerging news organizations that get government funding. And then also we have Joan Mauer. I think we addressed some of the questions that she raised, which was mostly to do with the future of VOA. Free Media Online. Professor Unger, this is for you. Did you know that the first chief VOA news writer and editor was Howard Fast, who in 1953 received the Stalin Peace Prize and was a Communist Party activist and journalist? Do you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I've heard this before. I suppose it's true if somebody has checked this out. There were people, this is a kind of McCarthyite question, if you ask me. Should we discredit someone retroactively because of something that he did at another time in his career? He was not a communist agent in the Voice of America, and there was nothing to suspect there were communist agents there. He went on to do some other things, and his political views moved in a certain direction. I mean, there are people, if we go that route, there are people available to be investigated now who have done things in terms of white supremacy and terrorism in this country, who who would not necessarily survive some of that investigation, especially because of some of the things that happened in the last administration. So I mean, it might amuse someone to say that someone who worked at VOA in the 40s or the 50s later won the Stalin Peace Prize. Well, maybe they had bad judgment in giving him the Stalin Peace Prize. Maybe
he also in his memoirs renounced communism and felt he was duped.
Of course he did.
But he was quite he was one of the authors who was purged during the McCarthyite.
Of course, yes.
But it's quite true that this was part of the problem that during the 1940s, journalism was a profession that had many left-wing people involved, and the Voice of America or the U.S. government had to work out the best way to manage its news organization. And during the war, I think there was, we would now accept that there was way too indulgent an attitude taken towards journalists were allowed to be politically freewheeling, and some really stupid things were said on the air.
Oh,
the most famous is that a VOA journalist broadcaster called the King of Italy a moronic little king, and that didn't help U.S. diplomacy at that particular moment, and it was not a particularly it was sort of editorializing in an unhelpful way, or repeating an editorial in an unhelpful way. There's a balance. Not everything that a journalist thinks belongs on the air, and not everything that a government thinks belongs in journalism.
It's also worth pointing out that the New York Times correspondent in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, a man named Walter Durrante, a biography has been written about him called Stalin's Apologist.
Yes,
he was duped into thinking that, I mean, it's quite relevant today. He was duped into thinking that Stalin was doing wonderful progressive things in the Ukraine when he was killing millions of people with a forced famine. He's had his Pulitzer Prize revoked, I believe, which he was given for his reporting in the Soviet Union at the time. Right. Of course, there are mistakes, and there are people who change their minds, and there are plenty in the other direction as well.
Well, I'm sure, Anne, you'd want to, throw some insights into that. But then also, while you're answering that question, there is a comment that also just came in. If you could speak to the return on investment for the American taxpayer funding VOA, gaining friends overseas for the U.S. and its slice of the PD pie, along with cultural diplomacy. I think we can all share that. But Anne, to you.
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer about, basically what you're asking is, if I'm an American taxpayer, what do I get out of this money being spent for this service? There isn't a real direct quid pro quo there. I think you have to believe in diplomacy and public diplomacy, and you have to take the long view that this is something that is worthwhile. But I'm not very good at articulating why.
To jump in here, the sums of money involved in international broadcasting, in public diplomacy, in exchange diplomacy, these are tiny sums of money compared to what is spent on aircraft carriers, what is spent on missile systems, which are not subjected to these kinds of to this requirement to be micro audited for benefit. And one of the problems with public diplomacy is and international broadcasting is that domestic constituencies skew agendas that we could see during the history of US international broadcasting. If you have a big diaspora community and it's in a politically influential place, then you're much likely to have funding for your broadcasts than other communities, other projects. So I think that it's tremendous value for money, especially compared to other things that the government spends money on. The problem for international broadcasting is it doesn't have the pork that makes legislators so enthusiastic about the aircraft carriers and the missile systems and the stealth fighters and the things that Americans seem to be delighted to spend money on.
Nick,
So I think it's astonishing value for money.
You made a very valuable point, Nick. When I was director of VOA, we calculated that the entire international broadcasting budget of the U.S. government was less than one wing of a B-1 bomber. And the cost of just putting one wing on the bomb per year. So
we've gone a little past the time, so I just want to put it out there so that we can really try and wrap up the conversation very soon. Roya, I would like to get to you about the question that was asked by Rick Barnes about the taxpayers' benefit. And then also, Professor Unger, I want to share a message with you that from Porch Reese, she says, or he said, you visited Cambodia when you were VOA director. What other countries did you visit back then? And what was your impression of the press freedom back then and now around the world? So I'll ask Roya first to share her thoughts, and then let's get to you.
Sure. I mean, I can say that the media is more powerful than craft and the war, and it has changing many of the people's lives in terms of giving the information, giving access to the cultural differences, and about the freedom of speech in democracies. And obviously, the Voice of America play the important role on that. And I think that, as you already mentioned, that is a small part of the tax goes to this, but I think that the soft power is more important, and I think that the media still play a very important role in changing the cultural norms, and as well in terms of that giving the younger generation in countries that that they don't have access to reliable source the fact, and they can fight in backs for their rights. So I think obviously it's a help myself to be in darkness, and then giving access to the outside world, and it's especially help my team, Afghan Girls Robotics Team, the time that they bound to come to the United States to watch their results rejected. I'm using the social media, and as well, the Voice of America created a couple of the documentaries and reports on that, and obviously other medias as well. But that's the way that it could push the governments to change their policies and allow them to come to the United States. So I think that it's really playing an important role.
That question also, Sandy, if you could also throw in the impression of the state of press freedom back then and now as it pertains to Africa as well.
Sure. Well, just briefly, yes, I did visit Cambodia. I have very vivid and wonderful memories of that visit. I went to Vietnam at the invitation of the then U.S. ambassador to celebrate the 5th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the United States and Vietnam. And the big act, the big celebration, the American country music was played. And there were some very, I can't bring up his name in my memory right now, but a very big country music star. This is in 1980, if I'm not mistaken. So it's quite a while. I'm sorry, in the year 2000. And so it's quite a while ago. But that was an example, by the way. We had fought this war with Vietnam. You would have thought they never would have wanted to have anything to do with the United States, but they were passionately interested in American country music. And I dare say that's true in Africa as well. I traveled quite a lot in Africa. We signed agreements with governments in Africa to carry VOA programs on FM stations, which hadn't been done in some of these places before. And we made agreements. I mean, it was quite intriguing. Daniel Arap Moi, the president of Kenya at the time, was not exactly a force for democracy. But I had met him many years earlier when I was a young journalist in Nairobi, and he remembered that, and he agreed to let our quite open and progressive programs, progressive in terms of telling the truth about what was happening in his country and others, on an FM channel, because through personal connections. The state of press freedom in the world today is very much endangered. I'm very worried about it. There's so many people. I'm worried about it in this country as well, by the way. I think that there are forces that could come to power in this country who do not understand the role of free media or understand it too well and want to suppress them. And that's why I have the Free Speech Project at Georgetown, to try to fight for First Amendment values in this country. But I think, there are many people around the world. Roya's the president of Hungary at the moment. I wish VOA still had a Hungarian service, although I was part of the decision to suspend it at the time. And in Africa, there's so many courageous journalists in Africa, in Cameroon, in Zimbabwe, in South Africa during the struggle for freedom there, many other places, Kenya, Nigeria, who have been repressed for going against the power structure, for going against commercial interests in many cases. And this is something the United States should fight for. I have long been an advocate of the idea that American foreign policy should include a First Amendment component, should work to have people respect these values of freedom that are so essential and defining of our democracy. And that was something that USIA, in fairness, did quite a bit of in its heyday, and maybe missing today, especially if there's no Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and
Public Affairs.
That's an appalling situation. You're quite right, Nick.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up soon, because I'm coming to you, Anne, and very briefly to wrap up, there is a comment that came through the comments that Walter Durant's Pulitzer Prize was never revoked. So I guess that's an ongoing debate.
There was a suggestion that it be revoked.
Yes.
And if you could offer your parting thoughts.
Okay, I don't have big parting thoughts, but on the question of Durrante, my recollection is that, the prize was given to him and not to the New York Times. So the New York Times has said, we don't have the prize to, what can we do? We don't have a prize that we can
give back,
renounce or give back. I just wanted to tell a very quick Sandy Unger story. I remember, I guess you were still VOA director. I was on a panel where I believe you had just come back from, in my memory, it's Bangladesh, and you talked about being there and saying, I was greeted like a rock star. and
I'll never forget it.
The most listened to, or the most, had the largest audience in Bangladesh. And that was a revelation to me, because I just knew VOA in the Cold War context, Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, did not realize that, it had a global reach, and that it, could be just as important in a place like Bangladesh or, many of the other countries that you just mentioned.
On that thing, I used to wear a little tiny lapel pin with a VOA microphone on it. We used to have thousands of them. We'd give them away.
I remember this.
and it was like it was an open sesame in so many parts of the world. You're from VOA? You're the director of VOA? So in Bangladesh, that was one of the most extraordinary trips of my entire life. And I've traveled quite a bit.
Well, thank you so much. This conversation has been so enriching. I am sorry that I am cutting into what you're saying, Sandy. But Roya, I would like to give you a few more minutes to just wrap up your thoughts on this conversation and, any insight going forward.
I think that at the end, it's important that we're making sure what's going on in Afghanistan to be covered more. And I use this platform to say that, unfortunately, the first couple of weeks of August, it was covered. But unfortunately, after that, many of the media stopped covering what's going on. Obviously, the Voice of America is one of them that is still covering the news in Afghanistan. But I hope that the other news doing that, because at this point, at this time, Afghanistan needs, and especially the women in Afghanistan, that they are protested. They need that their stories to be covered and their stories and their voice be heard. And I hope that's the only things that I wanted to mention. And obviously, I hope that independent media continues, especially with the Afghan local journalism. And I hope that Taliban will allow that, because it's bringing the accountability and transparency to the governments. And I don't know how it's worked, but we will going to fight more. And there are many of the journalists who went to exile, and many still are in Afghanistan. And I hope that they can have a platform that they can tell the real stories.
Thank you so much, Roya, and thank you so much to everyone. We had so many comments that unfortunately we couldn't get to, because the conversation was so rich and there were so many facts that came out of this. And I know everybody watching was so enlightened by the history that you all shared. So we hope to have this conversation again. As Yolanda mentioned earlier, there's going to be several series coming up, so there'll be a lot of opportunity. But before I go any much longer, I just wanted to acknowledge my panelists, my distinguished panelists, Professor Sanford J Unger, former VOA director and director of the Nonpartisan Free Speech Project at Georgetown University, Ann Cooper, Professor Emerita at Columbia Journalism School, Nicholas Cull, Professor of Public Diplomacy at the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, and Roya Mahboob, entrepreneur, and head of the company Digital Citizens Fund, and also co-founder of Afghan Robotics Team. Thank you so much. What a history Voice of America has had, and you brought it to life with all your insights and perspectives. And before I let everybody go, I just want to quickly announce that as we mark VOA's 80th year, we are planning about 4 similar public discussions, largely focused on the issues, the trends, and the stories that VOA covers every day and every year. So please watch out for the invitations for more of these. And if you're not on our email list, please do go to insidevoa.com and on that front page, and then sign up. I'm Ndimyake Mwakalyelye. It was such an honor to moderate this panel. Thank you so much. I learned a lot too. There's always so much to learn about public media, Voice of America, and the impact that it makes around the world. So on that note, we'll say thank you and goodbye to everyone.